Welcome to the Queer Witch Project, your resource for all things queer and witchy. I am Damona Peacock, a fabulous, non-binary, neurospicy, ordained queerdo with a fascination for all things cycles, symbolism, and patterns.
And I'm Moonkitty, your queer femme, poly kitchen witch, and proud geek. Today's topic is in our Queer Resistance series with magic as personal power with our returning guest, Victoria Skye.
Hi.
Yay! Hi,
Welcome
Tori.
back.
So glad to be here with you both. Yeah.
It feels like a little bit of a full circle moment. You were our first guest, and now
Hmm.
you're returning to come
Yeah,
talk to us again.
it was like late 2023, wasn't it?
Yeah, mid to late
Okay.
2023. It's hard to
Yeah,
believe.
time
What is,
flies.
what is time even?
Right.
What even is time?
Illusion.
Yeah. You haven't aged a day.
Not at all.
Thank
You're
you.
glowing.
Thank you.
But just in case, nobody or current listeners haven't dug that deep in the archives, I would like to read your bio if you don't mind.
Yes, yes,
Um,
please.
if you're new, Victoria Skye is a lifelong intuitive, a queer and neurodivergent person, and a heathen witch who grew up in fundamentalist Christianity before deconstructing and finding their true home in paganism. As a trained psychotherapist, Victoria works at the intersections of personal growth and magic. They are a tarot reader and an aspiring rune walker, as well as a spiritual leader, ritual creator, guide, and facilitator across a number of disciplines. Victoria is passionate about providing safe containers for people to meet their own divinity and connect with the powers of their choice. They firmly believe that our magic must be linked to our activism. Victoria is a devotee of the goddess Hel. They reside in Santa Cruz with 2 children and 2 cats. That would be 4 kids.
Yes, welcome back.
Thank
And the
you.
four-footed ones are the easier to take care of usually.
Nope.
To be determined.
DVD, yes. They all need attention, that's for sure.
Yes.
Yeah. I just said I'm so glad to be here.
Thank
Yay!
you.
So, we started at the beginning of this year with a series that we want to continue on with, keep building on, called Queer Resistance. We think it's very important to talk about resilience and resistance this year for what's going on globally and politically and all that. We don't really have to totally get into, let's just say, one collective blah, right? Ugh.
And for
Yes.
That's
those
all
who
we
may
gotta
catching
say.
us in the future, we are currently in the middle of 2025 in the United States to give global context of where we are at.
I wanted to invite you on here because you have a very interesting approach to magic and personal power. And I thought that that would be really fitting for a deeper exploration into these ideas of how to work our craft, how to show up as ourselves in a timeline that doesn't necessarily accept us or wants to bully
Yeah.
us or worse.
Mm.
And how do we keep our craft? How do we keep our magic? How do we show up as ourselves? And I know that we talked about your fundamentalist raising. There's a lot of deprogramming, I believe a lot of us have gone through.
Mhm.
And I think there's a lot of deprogramming our world needs. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that umbrella of topics that I just threw at your face.
Yes. There's so much there to discuss. I feel like we live in these overcultures of oppression that have always been with us and are definitely on the world stage and louder than normal.
Mhm.
For some of us, for some, they've always been very loud. But I think that there is such an important delineation between how we are being oppressed or how we are experiencing oppression and the systems of control that we put on ourselves to keep ourselves small. And I think that especially being raised in a fundamentalist Christian background, with a significant amount of trauma, and also being raised with a uterus, I very much felt that I sort of centralized power and control outside of myself. And I was very much waiting to be saved, waiting for somebody else to come in, whether it was, you know, some lofty ideal of Skye Daddy, or whether it was a husband, all of these things, that I was looking for that. And I think that the one thing that unwittingly magic taught me to do was to find my power within myself and to recognize that I was the one who is going to save myself. And for me, that started with my intuitive practices because I've been, an intuitive my entire life and, had a lot of what I like to refer to as hazing from the spirit world. And so it was really learning how to develop those gifts through divination that I started to find and like hone a personal sense of self and personal power and agency. Yeah.
Sometimes we don't listen to ourselves and, we call ourselves like we undermine that wisdom that we actually possess. We undermine it. Like, who do we think we are? Or, what do you know? Or even just how life is such a distraction. I love this phrase saying that we are human beings, not human doings. So
Mm,
we need to like stop and be for a while.
right.
So that intuitive practice, even the intuition, the messages that come in can be loud. And I think you really have to sit with yourself.
Mhm. Yeah. And we live in a world that doesn't really teach us how to do any of that. How it doesn't
Hmm.
teach us how to tap into source and tap into our own knowing and intuition, teaches us our bodies are inherently bad and sinful, need to be punished and made smaller, and all of these things that are only meant for extraction and consuming. So there's a lot to fight against in terms of programming, but it's valuable to get there in the end.
Hmm. No, I agree. When you're talking about organized religion in a lot of very strict, like fundamentalist, I wasn't fundamentalist, but I grew up Catholic. But again, there's a lot of organized, very structured. Thankfully, I had an amazing mom who let me explore and I could find my intuition and find that path early. But it was very much not what she had. And so many other people that I know who grew up in the church, same thing. It's hard to get, how do you find your intuition in yourself when all you are told is this indoctrinated idea of you are supposed to be this and the path to enlightenment is being submissive to your husband and or your the great father and not speaking up, not having a voice.
Yeah. And I think that's so important to highlight. I feel like looking back now, there was always a big part of me that didn't really buy into any of it. I wanted it to be true. I knew that the divine existed. That was something that I was sure of at 3 years old, that I had experiences with the divine that I tried to explain to my mom and never made any sense to her. So I never spoke of it again. But, I think that for me, what started happening was that I stopped apologizing for my initial first instinct. I stopped apologizing for feeling like this person wasn't right or the situation wasn't right. I stopped trying to force myself back into programming that didn't make sense to me. I remember at the end of 2015, I'd been divorced for about a year at that point. There was no social context for divorce in the communities I was raised in. It was like
Oh,
a sin worse than anything else. And I did it anyway. So I lost all
did
my
it anyway.
did it anyway, lost all my standing in community, but those were not my people. But I remember I thought, oh, I'm gonna celebrate winter solstice, right? And so I remember that it was just a very simple little like me releasing what I wanted to let go and like calling it what I wanted. I just burnt it on a picnic table outside in my backyard. And I remember getting done with that and just having this like huge moment of like, oh my God, this is why they burned the witches. This is why. Because I just sat here and I experienced something that has changed me that is profoundly holy. And I use that word intentionally. This is something that I created myself. I never needed anyone to do this for me.
Hmm.
And it's a bittersweet realization when you have these vulnerable child parts and angry teenager parts that are like, we want somebody to save us. We never should have had to do all this on our own. And it's really true, but that's, I think, how magic and sort of like psychotherapy come hand in hand, because there's a lot of reparenting that can happen in a magical practice, where you can teach those parts like, hey, there's an adult here now. There's a safe adult who loves you, who's never going to leave you, who believes you and is going to put you first. And I think that magical ritual is a beautiful way to do that.
Right. And it's 100% like that threshold that we were talking about being with yourself.
Right.
being in sacred space, being in the center. It's become ritual is magical because you set that special time and place aside to do it. You set these intentions. You're calling in your own power, and it's so powerful because for my little rant, I organized religions of all flavors, shapes, and sizes. This is not paganism is not exempt from this, but
Definitely not.
overall religion in general, to me, is about being the middleman, and it's
Mm,
about mind and thought control, and it's about resource confiscating, resource funneling.
right.
So often it's about making a whole big group of people believe this culture thought, group think, so that this small group at the top can take advantage of them. Being paid to be the middleman between your own personal power and your relationship with deity, God, whatever word you want to use. And I think witchcraft, paganism invites us into that being a personal relationship and being personally accessible in a way that I don't know that the overcultures, Abrahamic religions often teach.
Yeah. And just speaking to that a little bit, I mean, there are recent examples that we both could point to within paganism of people in higher systems of power within pagan structures that where, power was very much abused and there was very much an extractive relationship with others in that community. And
It
I
happens
it
a
does
lot.
happen. So I think it's important to point out that absolutely no group is exempt from this.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
part of what we're trying to do in decolonizing all the things all the time is learning how to not be in extractive hierarchical relationships with people and learning how to trust our own personal gnosis and not put that on anyone else and allow
Hmm.
people to also have their own experiences.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I definitely cringe when I'm approached by people who proselytize. I saw a meme recently that was like, the reason which you don't see witches at your doorstep being evangelical is because we know that if that's in your path, in your blood, in your system, if you're meant to that path, you will find your way to it, and we'll welcome you with open arms when you find
Exactly.
your way to us. But we're not trying to convert anybody. But I definitely don't need my soul saved by people who want to oppress me.
Exactly. It's so ironic that they say, hey, if you do everything that we say now in this lifetime, in another lifetime that we can't prove, things are going to be good for you. It's like, well, I don't
Why
know.
don't I just live the life that's in front of my face?
Why don't I just live the life in front of my face? And how about we examine and interrogate this idea that death is some sort of like a prescriptive moral judgment?
Hmm.
Because it all comes back to that. It all comes back to a fear of death.
That's very poignant. Or a misunderstanding of what life is, but those
Yeah.
could be two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. No, and I think that the best practices are the ones that encourage a person to continue trusting themselves and that also lead space for community involvement and community accountability.
Hmm.
That's another
I
important bit.
I mean, I do think that we need checks and balances. I think in our own ways, weave our web of life. We find our kind of people, our vibe of people,
Mhm.
because we definitely need. I'm not saying to go out there and do it without community, without learning from the elders, without, but just don't give them so much power over you that you lose your personal power, you lose your own energy, you lose your own way to your empowerment by doing what they want you to do.
Exactly.
Or
Yeah.
I said, if in learning you're not allowed to question, that is a big thing. Because again, community is important. Rules and guidelines are there for reasons. Oftentimes, it is safety, it is respect for culture or respect for elders and the wisdom that sometimes comes with it. But with all of that, you should still have the ability to question. And if you lose that
Yeah.
ability to question anything, that's when you're talking about hierarchical issues that could potentially be flawed or not not fair.
That it's
Because you end up working on somebody else's agenda to
Hmm.
their benefit and to your detriment, then there's something terribly wrong here. I think
Mhm.
there mutual community building, true community building is about mutual benefits, mutual upliftment, not competition, but I rise, you rise, we all rise together kind of vibe,
Yeah.
which I don't know. The thing about leadership is that there are natural born leaders, and then there's people who want power.
And the natural born leaders are not the ones clamoring for power or trying to keep it centralized because they know they have power. And that circles back to an understanding of personal power as well. somebody who has, who understands the full potency of their magical power and their personal power and agency isn't running around trying to tell other people what to do or like how they should live or trying to extract from them. They stand in their own integrity and they're at the helm of their own life. So, yeah.
The question everything.
Question everything. And I run around with a lot of radical Norse heathens and also reclaiming witches, and they all always say, if the gods want you to do something, you can always tell them to fuck off if you don't want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Can we swear on here?
If we do, if I think we do like one or two. Beyond that, I usually kind of bleep some of them out, but it depends. We've had the Spectre more. It was real. We had the bless their heart young Gen Z, whose every other word was fuck, because it was the cool thing to do, which was really challenging to actually make it a cohesive thing. But if it comes out naturally in conversation, I'm not gonna edit it out if it makes sense in context, and I think our listeners will appreciate that too.
Honestly, sometimes there's power and magic in the curse words. It's just the time and a place.
Yeah.
So when we were talking about this episode, I remember we discussed something about our conscious minds versus that they don't want to remember our own power sometimes. We talked about that fundamental upraising. We talk about the Christian fundamentalist culture that we're in, but also just our political culture. It's still deeply patriarchal, even though slowly people have fought for more access. People of color, people of different genders, of queerness, have fought to get a seat at the table. Traditionally, the majority of the table is still very patriarchal and very colonizing. So we're indoctrinated, we're programmed to forget our relationship with our personal power. Our conscious minds are not always thinking about these things.
Well, I just feel like I come back to this a lot because, in my therapy practice, which I'm not here as a therapist, I'm here as an individual. Nothing I say is like representative of my workplace, disclaimer. But that being said, I work primarily with women and queer people and trans people. And the thing that I see again and again is that we have been so brainwashed into thinking that that we need these systems. I look at how hard, I'm a survivor of intimate partner violence, and I spend a lot of time in victim recovery spaces. And I am blown away by how deeply the programming goes, that these are people who are trying to hold on to relationships that are so profoundly harmful because they're like, well, I want to be sure I've done everything that I could have done. And I'm like, this person doesn't even like you. They don't care about you. And yet you're so desperate to hold on to this construct of marriage or, a committed relationship. What do you want? Like, what are we spending all this time? Like, they had to brainwash us because we were so powerful. And it's been insidious and effective. And I think that it's so important that we recognize that our conscious minds are working overtime to make us forget our power, to make us forget. When we were little, like I remember being just very, very young and just having such a different sense of the world. In the work I've been blessed to do with my therapist on internal family systems, I've met like 3-year-old parts of myself who were like, we have to hide this. We have to tamp this all down. No one can know the things that we know, that we came in knowing. And it's only been now in my 30s and 40s that I've started to actually be able to interact with those parts and access my power. And I think you don't have to, it's just like, if you think about like an abuser who isolates their victim, it's the same thing. You don't necessarily have to tell somebody they don't have power, but you can make it emotionally uncomfortable enough to remind them of it that they'll just stop doing it on their own. Because most abusers, as with most overcultures of oppression, are nothing if not lazy, and they don't want to have to work harder than they need to.
And I think that's what's so scary about this current trad wife movement that we're starting to see pick up with the younger generation and everything else. And this whole idea of with our generation, because we're all roughly in the same era, it was the 1950s housewife kind of thing. And now it's this kind of trad wife concept that it has been re-evolved into something that's not realistic and not accurate. And it's really interesting seeing how it is creeping into the culture of clothing, the culture of what people are looking at, what's become stylish, what's become everything else. And it's now more about this conformity and this fitting in. And like you said, this back regression back into this kind of indoctrination of, hey, someone's going to take care of me. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure this marriage works. That's my role, my responsibility as a good wife. And it's
Right.
terrifying,
There
especially
will
as queer
always,
people.
Yeah.
right, I was about to say, there will always be round pegs that will never fit into those square holes.
Hmm.
And I'm one of them. And I think a lot of our listeners are those kind of people. Like we don't fit into that mold. I hope that we can continue standing out in our own ways.
Yeah. And for me, the trad wife movement is nothing new because that was literally what I was indoctrinated to be growing up. Like, you stay at home. You know, I was around adults who were openly questioning whether or not women belonged in college, because does that really serve a woman who's going to be at home with children, And it's crazy. And it's funny too, just coming from like the small snippet of, like fringe that I came from, people are like, we don't understand how Trump could have, and I'm like, you guys, this has been the plan like for decades. Like, my parents are dyed-in-the-wool Trump supporters. They prayed for this since Reagan left office.
Well, and I
So,
actually, I think about coming back around to resilience and resistance. I think
right.
about how, in the reality that some of these people would want us all living in, the three of us couldn't be talking on these
Mm-mm.
topics at all, to people at all. Like, how dare we open our mouths? And my act of resistance and resilience is I'm still here doing, flapping the gabs, gabbing the gibs,
Yeah.
whatevs.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's where the intersection comes between where you're speaking publicly and nobody wants women and queer people and trans people to do that right now, especially not from alternative religions. But there's a difference between being told to sit down and shut up actively and just being in a hostile environment,
Mm-hmm.
And one of my
Or
favorite
boiling.
feminist writers says, I love staying in spaces where I'm not supposed to be. And I think there's a lot of power in that. We're not going to go away. We've always been here and we are going to continue hurting their feelings.
I mean, just they can be uncomfortable. Maybe they need to just learn to live with that.
Yeah, exactly.
Live with your discomfort. So, which is worse, the fear of failure or the fear of success or the fear of the unknown?
It's a really good question. I feel like people so often say they're afraid of failure, but failure often translates to rejection. When I do EMDR with clients, they'll say, well, it made me feel XYZ. I was a failure. And I'm like, what are you afraid would be true about you if you're a failure? Just failing is it's morally neutral, right? What does it mean about you as a person if you fail? And often it boils down to something like, I don't deserve good things, or I'm unworthy, or I'm unlovable. And so being able to interrogate that negative belief about yourself is very important. But I think even more insidious is this idea of, what if I succeed? What am I going to do? How am I going to define myself and my life if I find out that I am not as disempowered as I have led myself to believe that I am?
Or have been led to believe, but
Right.
in both, because we
Right.
allow the tapes to repeat. Sometimes, yeah, so we on our journey get in touch with our personal power. Now, what do we do with it?
Right. It changes the way you live because all of a sudden you can't be going around attaching yourself to people who aren't similarly at the helm of their own lives. You can't do that. It means a fair degree of loneliness at times. Because when you understand that you have power and that you're responsible for yourself, this is the only death to us part relationship we will ever actually be able to depend on. And when
Ding,
you
ding, ding.
realize no one's coming to save me, I have to save myself. And in doing so, that's how I stay in my own integrity, because then there are no strings attached to that salvation, right? And that's really powerful. And it feels lonely at times. It can. But when you stay there and you stay in that integrity, you find other people who are doing the same.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that's all coming from a place of authenticity and truth.
There's
And
one of my most favorite music lines that popped in my head is that when I chose to live, there was no joy. It's just a line I crossed. It wasn't worth the pain my death would cost. So I was not lost or found.
Yeah.
And I feel like every day is just one step further into like living out of spite for what's going on around. Bringing beauty and love into a world out of necessity for the lack thereof.
Yeah.
What were you going to say, Shay?
I was going to say a lot of that with, like I said, the responsibility is that when you step into your power, you tend to become and get comfortable in being in your power. You naturally get people gravitating towards you and you get into that leadership role. oftentimes when you're building community and building resistance and resistance actions. But with that power comes the ultimate responsibility.
Thanks,
And
Spider-Man.
that's, yeah, thanks, Spider Man. But when it comes down
It's
to
true.
everything else, it's really true. And that's when you go back to those who want power versus those who are in leadership roles, and understanding
Mm-hmm.
that with power comes that responsibility to deal with the uncomfortable, to stand, like you said, in those uncomfortable spaces and be there, but also take the words that are coming at you, the acts, the threats, the other things that come with that, and having the strength to stand in that is incredibly difficult for a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people who have gone through, again, this idea of I was not strong enough, or I should be kept down, so here, this is where my level is. To be able to have that ability to step into their power and step up, is that's I think that's where that fear of failure comes into it, and that fear of success, rather, because if I step into that, that means I'm going to have to do more, and I'm going to have to take responsibility for the power that I am moving into, the power that I'm going to generate by being this resistance.
Exactly, because if I can do it the once, then I know that I could have always done it, right? And then what
Mm-hmm.
does that mean? How does that redefine how my ego sees all of this, right? Because I think ego wants us to be disempowered. Ego wants us to like be reaching and grabbing, and it
Mm.
Ego
very
wants it easy.
ego wants it easy. Ego wants there to be like some mythical sky daddy that says, yes, you are worthy, or yes, no, you aren't. You must work harder. It's like so much easier to flail than it is to actually stand up for something and stand up for yourself.
My thought on failures is that every success, every scientific discovery, every new amazing great thing is often founded on a stepstone of failed attempts or failed
Mm-hmm.
guesses, incorrect, getting things wrong. So I think there's actually a necessary courage to failing, and I don't think we get anywhere in this world if we're not willing to risk that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And getting back to like a practical magical practice, I think that's another thing that helps you to hone your personal power is that you try things,
Mm-hmm.
and you keep
Yeah.
and you experiment. And maybe I did the spell one way the first time I did it, and the second time I did it, I can look at the results that I had because I kept track because I don't expect my conscious mind to remember because it won't. So you have to like keep logs of these things and pay attention to like the signs and the portents and stuff. And then the next time I do it, I might do it much more simple. It might be like, type 5 as opposed to like a 15-minute thing, because now I know, okay, like this is what worked, this is what didn't. Here are the ways afterwards that I did the spell that I see I'm getting in my own way. And I think I've talked about this on this pod before about like the idea of a magical hangover that
Mhm.
usually after I do a magical working, I'm always like slapped upside the head with all of the things I'm doing to block the very thing I said I wanted. And usually that involves like a lot of humility and a lot of like, oh yeah, like I really am trying to disempower myself in this situation. And I have the power to pull this thing in, but what am I going to do when I get it? Am I ready for the thing that I say that I want or the thing that I say I need? What am I getting out of being this weakened version of myself, even as like I'm holographically like pulling in this other thing?
Along those lines, then, how do we find our power? What advice would you give to the listeners who are like, all right, I want to embrace, I want to
Yeah,
wield my inner power? What do you tell them?
it's so hard to know how to answer that question because I think it's very personal for everybody. But the first thing that pops into my head is like, what is your body telling you? I think so often we're taught to be so cerebral, thanks Susie Toot, and like in our heads about everything, and when we can really just drop back into the frame of our bodies and just really tune into what's happening there. Our bodies are giving us constant information about situations we're in. Chronic pain, inflammation, all of these things, like they all are speaking to us. And maybe they're speaking to things within our control and maybe they're not. But there's so much wisdom to be found by just taking a moment and not saying yes to anybody or anything and just saying, okay, like what am I feeling right now? And really like I teach my clients a lot to like put your hand on your chest and just be like, I've got you. I'm listening. Like, what do you have to tell me? you
I
know?
like that.
Yeah, I think that that can be really helpful. And people will come to me and they'll be like, oh my God, like, how do I start a magical practice? And I'm like, you start simple. You start by like, drawing a card every day or putting out a bowl of water for like the spirits of land around you. Or I don't know, like lighting a candle with an intention. It doesn't have to be this like complicated thing. And I think a lot of people, when they come to magic, they're expecting the more recent iterations of like Wicca, for example, where it's high ceremony. And like, don't get me wrong, I love high ceremony, right? But
Yeah.
a lot of folk magic just relies on like using whatever you have around you. Like
Mhm.
I don't have an athame. I do have a peanut butter knife though. Like being able to just really work with what's present for you in your environment, for example. And then just learning, I think divination practices are really important for learning how to trust yourself. And along those lines, working with, ancestors. We all have ancestors, whether we knew them, whether we didn't. On the other side, they are very different than they were here on Earth, and they understand a lot more, and they're able to field a lot for us. And many of them really would want to work with somebody who actually realizes that they're there, because most people don't. So calling in the spirit guides and the deities and powers, if that resonates for you, or working with the spirits of the land around you, and starting to create like a team, and all of that, it's like a symbiotic relationship. And that greatly amplifies your sense of your own power. And just getting out there and casting for what you want, whatever it is, and continuing to do that. And over time, you start to realize like some of the spells that I've done have been hugely successful and it ended up being disastrous, right? And
Well, yeah, be careful what you ask for,
Mhm.
you will get
and
it.
know what you want.
You will get it.
Yeah.
Yes. I cast for a lover once and I ended up in a 2 year and a 2.5 year abusive relationship. But I tell you what, he was exactly what I cast for. So, and I don't like blame
And you
myself or
learned a
anything.
lot.
Yeah, I didn't deserve that or anything. But, I was like, oh, I really am very powerful. So I guess I'd be really, really better be careful. But even in those sort of like, explosions or things that go kerflooey, there's a lot of wisdom to be gained if you're willing to listen and come to it with playfulness and curiosity.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think too, one other thing we had discussed before was just this idea of like we need other people. We're not supposed to
Yeah.
be doing this on our own,
Mhm.
and capitalism is just like any abuser is very effective at isolation. And
Mm-hmm.
we're so busy and burnt out, but making time to be with people, whether that's in an online format, if that's what's accessible to you, or in person, making time to celebrate, making time to spend time in queer community. And we need those things right now. They're medicine. And community ritual is an act of resistance. Because when I'm in my power and you're in your power and you're in your power, maybe we don't agree on every single point, and that's okay. We are united together in the fight for justice and the fight for liberation of all beings, right?
Mhm.
And being able to stand shoulder to shoulder with people who are fighting for liberation, I think is really, really powerful. And people are mirrors and they teach us things about ourselves too.
That's
As-
100% true.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, my question is like, with that, with queerness being an act of resistance in and of itself, and standing with people and having this multi-generational kind of aspect to it, because we always talk about honoring our elder queers and those who came before us, but also respecting those who are coming after us. How do we do that? How do we honor those before and teach the next generation while still trying to figure out what the hell we're doing as we're going around in the middle?
I think that that's something that happens really naturally in community. I was sitting on a planning meeting yesterday with a bunch of old dykes and a trans woman, and we're getting ready for the Santa Cruz Dyke Trans March. And it was really beautiful because these are women who have been visibly queer for decades, like a couple of them are in their 50s and 60s, right? And they're up with the pronouns and they're up with the new identities and they've been very clear we all belong. So I think, they want to be included and need to be included. And many of them are willing to learn or are actively learning. And for young people to be able to see, like, hey, the old line, it gets better, like you can have a full, happy life with people who are like you don't have to hide yourself away. So I think that that is something that can happen naturally in community together. And like I said, community is wildly imperfect and there are all kinds of bad actors and, but there's also joy to be found and we're all so wildly perfectly imperfect.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think it's really important that we are aware of the web of life that we create with how we interact with those around us.
Yeah.
Even though we are ostracized or bullied, to be able to still find people like us to love, to be loved by, to just take joy in and celebrate, and mutual celebration of successes and empowerment. I think it's in trying times, especially like in illness or injury, or as things get scary out in the world, we've become more aware of what interactions really feed our soul. Who shows up for us when we're down and out? Who's been taking, and not being very giving, versus who's you can find like this beneficial, mutual caretaking, mutual investment in people. And look, you're not going to be the flavor for everybody. And no, like we said, within the community, nobody's perfect. But I think it's important when you are feeling isolated or alone, especially the queer youth, when they're in those small towns and they haven't had a chance to leave the nest and spread their wings and fly and find their people, just know that the perseverance, the resistance, the resilience that you conjure up gets you further down the road and closer to that time in which you can find those people. You will build your chosen family. You will have this web of life that really is woven around you that catches you when you fall. For some people, they're blessed to be born with biological family that can be that for them, but not all of us got that. But I will promise you that it's out there for each and every one of you, as long as you're willing to use, that discernment of what your values are, and who vibes with that. And, again, people aren't going to get it perfect, but you'll know when it feels draining versus when it feels soul fulfilling, soul enrichment, and make sure that you keep that balance.
Yeah. And I think about something that you always say, Damona, that I think really intimidates people who aren't in touch with their own power. You say, like, when my boat rises, I want your boat to rise too. And I think
like
that comes from a place of wanting everybody to be liberated, wanting everybody, because like if you are in touch with your own personal power, you have no reason to want anyone to be oppressed or to want anyone to have less than what they need.
Yeah.
If you're out of touch with that, then you're going to be wildly toxic and harmful because you don't understand that you have your own agency and control, right? And I think that that's such a beautiful way to think about it, think about personal powers, that when I'm in mine and you're in yours, then we can all, go together.
Well, I'm really grateful that you were willing to come talk to us more on this topic, that we could revisit resilience and resistance and, shore ourselves up for the next journey. And just, what's our takeaway from all of this? One is definitely find your people.
Definitely find your people and find the people within yourself.
Yep.
There's so much power that you have, has always been there. You think back to when you were a child, and I don't know, like try to remember what they made you forget. It's always been there. And you've always known the way.
That's awesome.
There's a reason they disempower us.
Yep.
So now it's time to take your power back.
Absolutely.
As we all shall hopefully continue to be doing.
Yes.
Because it's
And
important. And vote.
And vote.
Sometimes it feels like that's not enough anymore, but
No,
yeah.
it's not.
Speak up.
Yeah.
Speak up. Make your voice heard in whatever way you can.
And listen to yourself. As humans, on a humanitarian level, we can all agree that some of this stuff is not right. It's not okay. It's not humane. Yeah. So we need to make sure that we're speaking to the humanity of it all.
Yes. Yes. I agree. Don't let them make you lose your humanity, for sure. Yeah.
Don't let the bastards grind you down.
Thank you so much, Tori, for coming out on. It was really amazing having you back and hearing all of this and helping us remind what we need to do and what we can do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Such a pleasure to come here.
It's always a pleasure to be able to be dazzled by your words and your grace.
Thank you. You smoothie you.
Thank you for listening to the Queer Witch Project. If you like what you heard, make sure to leave us a comment, give us some, stars or thumbs up or subscription, likes, whatever those buttons are on whatever you're listening to us does. We love when you interact with us. We love hearing from you.
And if there's a topic you want to know more about or an episode topic you'd like to suggest, contact us at thequeerwitchproject@gmail.com or find us on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram with the handle @queerwitchproject. We upload every other week. And remember, queerness is a key to magic.
Be yourself and love rebelliously. Bye.
Bye.